Capitola Black Recordings presents an unabridged recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker, or A Lady of England. Chapter 20. Warning. May He who is the Father of the fatherless and the helper of the widow reward you, and return this kindness 100-fold into your bosom. Such was the widow's blessing, as on the flight of steps beneath the lofty portico, she parted from her young benefactor. The blessing lay warm at the heart of Maurice. He needed its soothing power, for pride, anger, and resentment were struggling with fierce energy there. The young man's spirit was full of bitterness, and he plunged into the thickest recess of the wood, striding on at a rapid pace, as if he hoped thus to leave painful thought at a distance. "My situation is intolerable," he muttered to himself. "Have I no means of escaping from this bondage? There is here perpetual contact with sordid selfishness and sensuality. The very atmosphere I breathe is tainted with worldliness. I am dependent on the favor of my uncle, and the only way to preserve that favor is by drinking deep, flattering falsely, chaining down every generous impulse, every noble aspiration, and becoming like himself." Maurice checked himself, upbraided by the monitor within. "Ungrateful that I am, and it is with such feelings that I regard one from whose liberality I have experienced so many benefits. How painful is obligation where there is no attachment! What a heavy burden it is a debt owed to one whom it is impossible to revere. He would exclude from me the only influence which has hitherto been as the breath of heaven, preserving from corruption and guilt. Does he think that his gold or his acres could repay me for the loss of one real friend, one friend who speaks to me as my father would have spoken, had God been pleased to spare him to his son? That strange dream which I had when I was a boy seems realized in the life which I lead here. How often I am tempted in the pursuit of the wildest pleasures to indemnify myself for the privations of my childhood and the mortifications of my youth. Do I pass one evening under yon roof without every inducement being held out to me to drown my sense of right and wrong in the maddening draught which it is deemed womanish weakness to abstain from? Is there no danger that I may in time give up the weary struggle, that constant temptation may at length wear away the impressions made in my first happy, holy home, made by those who can speak to me no more of the heaven to which they showed me the way? As that time-serving Glidden is seeking to wrest from me my earthly inheritance, a far more dangerous and subtle foe would steal that immortal jewel which was shadowed forth in my dream. May they not both succeed?" As Maurice, buried in his own thoughts, proceeded on with rapid stride, he took little note of his path. It now lay along the course of that stream so often mentioned in preceding chapters, that stream beneath whose waters the Atma had for years lain buried. A thin mantle of ice was over it now, and the long branches of the willows that bent over it were whitened with a crust of frost. Maurice strode up the grassy bank to the pathway which led towards the public road, and vaulted over the turnstile by which Margaret Miles had once stood watching the baronet angling in the brook. Maurice was instinctively taking the nearest way to the vicarage, an instinct drawing him towards the friends who might throw light upon the chaos of his troubled thoughts when he encountered Edward Manton. It was the second time they had met on that day. The missionary's first glance at the young man's countenance convinced him that something of a painful nature had occurred during the brief space of time that had elapsed since Maurice had quitted the vicarage. The greeting between the gentlemen was cordial. Somers turned and changed the direction of its course, and the two were soon walking together at a slackened pace in deep and earnest consultation. There was a stamp of sincerity and truthfulness on Edward Manton that led even those who had had little previous intercourse with him to regard him with instinctive confidence. Maurice found his words flow more rapidly and freely in speaking to the younger Manton than in addressing the vulnerable pastor, his father. The same wisdom might enlighten both, the same high principle guide, but the vicar's son could sympathize better with the impetuous feelings of youth. Maurice laid his position, his trials, his temptations before his friend. He spoke to him of the resolutions which he had made by the grave of his parents, and in the moonlit chamber where he had dreamed that which had left so indelible an impression upon his mind. Manton, as he listened in silence, learned almost as much from the tone and manner of his companion as from his words, and he lifted up his heart in prayer for such guidance as might enable him to act an elder brother's part towards one who so much needed a friend. "And how," exclaimed Maurice, in conclusion, "how am I to meet the difficulties which surround me? How reconcile my position with my principles, the claim of religion with the claim of my uncle?" "May I speak freely to you, Somers?" said Edward Manton. "Can you doubt it?" was the earnest reply. "It seems to me that you have hardly yet learned the lesson conveyed in the dream which you have just related to me. You see vividly enough the aspect of the various temptations which beset you. You feel intensely the value of that soul which these temptations would imperil, but you do not sufficiently fix your eye on the lifeboat and the form within it. You rather call pride to your aid. You reject evil because you despise it, till in your scorn of what is worldly, selfish, or base, you confound the sin with the sinner." "Do you mean in the case of Sir John?" demanded Maurice. "Of Sir John's character I have no wish to speak. His nephew is perhaps the last man on earth who has a right to judge or condemn it." Maurice was silent, but quickened his steps. "In considering his comfort, in obeying his wishes, when they involve no disobedience to a higher law, you surely follow the path marked out to you by that Providence which was pleased to make him the channel of all the earthly advantages which you possess." "Perhaps," said Maurice thoughtfully, "I have of late neglected my uncle. An unloved and unloving benefactor has appeared somewhat in the light of a tyrant, and the debt of obligation in that of a yoke. Besides," he added, drawing up his form to its full height, and walking with a prouder step, "besides, as my prospects in the world are entirely in his hands, I should have been degraded in my own eyes by acting the part of cringing dependent, a fawning sycophant." "Forgive the question," said Manton, "but is that sensitiveness which you feel only the sensitiveness that shrinks from contact with evil? Has it nothing of the nature of earthly pride?" "You would not have me self-interested and worldly," said Maurice in a tone of impatience, "a slave to the lust of gold." "As little as I would have you proud and self-reliant, the slave of a will unsubdued. You must, my friend, seek your strength not in your own resolutions, and your safety not in your own loftiness of soul. As in your dream, it was the cry for help from above which divided the flames before you, and showed you a way of escape. So it must now be by faith and prayer that in the midst of multiplying temptations you can walk secure, as the saints of old in the fiery furnace. Regard not your duty towards God and your duty towards man as separate, and scarcely compatible one with the other. The love of Christ that constraineth. This must be the soul's vital principle to preserve it alike from worldliness and pride, from visible temptations from without, or more subtle and dangerous temptations from within." Several minutes of silence intervened. It was broken by Maurice, briefly but cordially, thanking his friend for his candour. "I know not," he said then, "if you will approve of a design which has for years been forming in my mind, but which has only lately taken a definite shape, a plan which, if followed out, might remove me to scenes more congenial, and give me an opportunity of winning a competence in a way less opposed to my inclination. I am anxious to enter some honourable profession." "Have you spoken on the subject with your uncle?" "Not yet, at least, not in a decided manner." "Would he be likely to oppose your wishes?" Maurice hesitated a little in his reply. "I scarcely know," was his answer. "I think it possible that Sir John might dislike any change that would involve my long absence from Grandmont. He has initiated me into his ways. I know his tenants. I look over his accounts. I believe that I am useful to him in various trifling matters. At least I was so, till Mr. Gliddon's arrival. He has relieved me from some of my cares." and would willingly relieve you entirely from all?" The young man smiled in assent. "If I might give advice," said Edward Manton, "I would counsel you not to enter upon the subject of your future destination until Mr. Glidden has quitted this place." "That will happily be next week, and within the month he will be in the Bay of Biscay on his return to the East." "While he remains, be circumspect and guarded, less for your own sake than for that of others. Give no handle to misrepresentation, control the expression of your irritated feelings, be—" "Worldly wise," interrupted Maurice, with something approaching to a sneer. "Not so," said Manton earnestly. "If at any time duty be on one side, and interest on the other, however small the duty, however great the interest may appear, unhesitatingly, unflinchingly sacrifice to principle every mere temporal advantage. But be certain first that your own heart be not deceived, that pride and resentment have not assumed the guise of virtues, that if you suffer, it be indeed for conscience' sake, and not because you have given the rein to passions as much opposed to the spirit of your religion as those which you scorn and condemn." Thank you for listening to Capitola Black Recordings. I hope you have enjoyed this recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker.